In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists themselves. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response of some sort. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for only 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased even in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his very arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had been manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoke with God, and He has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Follow-up study, 2000. Dr. G.F., Department of Neurology, San Francisco, California. Recent study of degenerative disease in which targets the motor function and cognitive decline often leads to hallucinations of the deceased. Death of the targeted cells and chemicals in the brain by this disease leads to a loss of smell, among other senses. The cause of the disease is unknown. Hallucinations present in 39.8% of the patients, falling into 3 categories: a sensation of a presence or person, a sideways passage, or illusions, present in 25.5% of patients, an isolated occurrence in 14.3%. Formed vital hallucinations present in 22.2%, isolated in 9.3%. And auditory hallucinations present in 9.7%, though isolated in only 2.3%. Continuing study in San Francisco, California, date 2003 to present. This is a set of instructions for how to speak with the devil, which, as those of you with any sort of brains might note, is a patently moronic proposition on the face of it. One likely to culminate in any number of thoroughly unpleasant fates. Honestly, it would probably be smarter to publish your credit card number onto Facebook, and maybe take up a career in crocodile wrestling. Anyway, that's not going to stop you, is it? Not if you're sincerely interested, at least. Technically, if you do everything just right, there's a fair chance you'll walk away scot-free. And that seems to be reason enough, for some people at least, to decide that's a good idea. Especially if you're the fate-tempting, thrill-seeking, scare junkie type. Or desperate. Which brings me to a point of clarification I ought to make. This is not a manual for making any kind of Faustian bargain. You know, the whole sell your soul type of deal. Although, if you happen to bring it up in conversation, he certainly wouldn't be one to refuse. Following through with the foolhardy bargain, however, would necessitate removing some of the precautions that you have put in place for your conversation, and I don't think I need to spell out why that would be a bad idea. If you're really mathematically impaired enough to want to trade something that will last an infinite number of years for something that might last about 90 tops, there are plenty of other rituals out there for you to follow. This one, if performed correctly, should only allow the two of you to talk. This perhaps begs the question of why exactly would you want to speak with the devil in the first place? Maybe some of you just like the idea of making small talk with extremely dangerous occult entities, but for the sake of the human race, I hope most of you aren't quite that stupid. Short answer: he knows things. Things that some of you may have a deep, vested interest in finding out. I mean, he's not omniscient or anything, much as he might try to pretend otherwise. He's not God. But he's definitely got a supernatural advantage over the kind of knowledge that any human would be able to obtain. For example, he probably wouldn't be able to predict the next world war or tell you the cure for cancer, but he could very well be able to predict the winning numbers for tomorrow's $500 million Powerball drawing, or tell you what deadly, undiagnosed condition might be afflicting one of your loved ones. Of course, the Prince of Darkness doesn't just go around giving out winning lottery numbers to anybody who asks, so trusting any sort of information obtained from a being commonly described as the father of all lies is liable to land you in a very shitty situation. Much worse than when you started, at least. However, if you're really dead set on finding something out, and you've exhausted all the other options, there is a way to try to get accurate information out of the guy. You see, like so many of the other urban villains in popular culture, the devil has a bit of a penchant for games and gambling. Of course, the reason he likes them so much is that, well, he almost always wins. Unless you happen to be a fiddler named Johnny, or being represented by Daniel Webster, you're probably going to get your ass handed to you, kid. But if you're determined enough to want to face the risk and the long odds, there's a certain game the two of you could play and try to win the information you need. First thing is first. You'll need to start off with a description of the summoning process, and then we'll get the rules of the game, some tips of how to play, and finally, of course, the inevitable litany of arcane shit that might go horribly wrong. In order to contact your conversational partner, you'll need to go to a church at midnight. It doesn't matter what kind of church, large or small, old or new, liberal or conservative, just as long as you are sure it will be empty. The last thing you want is for some preacher to walk in on you while you're in the middle of this, and for the sake of the preacher, as well as your own well-being. The process will probably work best if you try it on a new moon, or a full moon, or Friday the 13th, or Halloween. You know what? The actual day is a lot less important. It's more the psychological effect it has on you. As long as you don't try it on Christmas Eve or something stupid like that, you'll be fine. Probably. The time is important, though. You don't have to start or end your ritual exactly at 12 a.m. Greenwich Atomic Time or anything like that, but as a general rule of thumb, you ought to show up a bit before midnight and have everything set up by no later than 10 or 15 after. Show up a lot before midnight if you don't know what you're going to be doing to get into the building. Shockingly enough, most houses of God tend to lock their doors at night, so at least if there's no one there to watch over them. And remember, we want an empty church. Got it? There are, of course, certain things you need to bring and certain things you cannot bring for this ritual. You will need a full can of salt. You don't need to use all of it, but it's always better to have more than less. 7 candles, red or white being preferable. Something to light the candles with. You would be shocked how often people forget this. Occult ritual or not, they're not just gonna magically light themselves. A length of red string, rope or yarn or something like that. A full-length floor or wall mirror. Ideally, you want to find one of these already present in the church. They're a bit unyieldy to be lugging around in the break-in. However, if there really aren't any there, well, you gotta bring your own. You might also find it useful to bring some markers, pencils, paper, a flashlight, and any sort of tools that might be necessary to secure your entrance into the church. You will not be permitted to bring any electronic timekeeping devices. This includes all cell phones, smartphones, tablets, e-readers, MP3 players, PDAs, calculators, wristwatches, pocket watches, kitchen timers, hourglasses, etc., etc., etc. Seriously, this shit is worse than the SATs. If you're one of those people that has your smartphone practically wired into your brain, don't worry, you can bring those things with you into the church as long as you leave them outside of the room in which you'll be doing the ritual. If you brought a flashlight, or, something that's helpful to find your way around without attracting unwanted attention, then leave that outside too. Also, don't bring any sort of religious paraphernalia to protect you, especially if it pertains to the Abrahamic religions, and yes, those gothy black cross earrings you're wearing that are hanging right side up, they count. If you have any kind of holy symbols like that, you're gonna need to get rid of them. The devil will simply refuse to show up if they're there. Don't worry, you're not going to be totally unprotected. In fact, most of the supplies I just listed off are more for your protection than the actual summoning. Old superstitions and folk magic remedies to guard oneself from evil. From what I know of it, the effects mostly are based on the power of belief, so there are probably a number of other objects and artifacts that would work the same way, but whatever. If you'd like to risk being left helpless at the mercy of the devil in order to test that theory, yeah, feel free to experiment. However, for anyone without a psychotic death wish, I'd recommend sticking to the ritual as follows. Once you're sure you have all the right supplies with you, make your way into the church and find some place to set up. It can be anywhere from the main sanctuary where services are held to a Sunday school classroom. To a walk-in supply closet, honestly. As long as you have the significant amount of open floor space and are certain to not be disturbed. Set up your mirror first. This is where the devil will appear when you summon him. As such, you mustn't complete the summoning until you've laid down all of the wards around it. First, surround the mirror with an unbroken circle of salt. If the mirror is hanging on a wall or a door or something like that, lay down in a semicircle around instead, making sure that the salt touches the wall at both ends. Then wrap your red string around the mirror several times. The color red is symbolic for many cultures and religions. This is why the candles should probably be red too, is a good idea. Speaking of the candles, set them up outside of your circle or semicircle of salt, spaced at relatively even intervals. No, you don't need to go measuring with tape, but try and eyeball it, Light the candles in a clockwise fashion, being careful not to disturb the salt. If you break the circle, you'll have to start all over again. Once all the candles are lit and burning strongly, your protective wards are complete. You are now ready to proceed with the actual summoning. Congratulations. To do so, you must first get the devil's attention and demonstrate your resolve by performing some sort of sacrilegious act in the holy space. Yeah, turning a crucifix upside down, it'll work. It's fairly conventional. But it's not the only option. For example, I know of a kid who once fulfilled this requirement by scribbling obnoxious graffiti all over a painting of Jesus hanging in his classroom. See, the nice thing about the cross, though, is that once you've finished, assuming you've survived, you can just flip it right side up again and no one's the wiser, sidestepping the relatively minor but still irritating risk of having your Sunday school turn into a reenactment of the Spanish Inquisition for the next month and a half. After you finish doing whatever offensive thing you decide on, shut all the doors to the room and turn off all the lights, so that the space is only lit by the candles. Face the mirror and stare deeply into it, concentrating on your desired outcome. There are no incantations, no arcane strings of Latin you have to recite. Just look into the mirror and wish as hard as you can for the devil to appear. And after a few moments of this, when you feel ready, close your eyes and count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If all has gone correctly, you will no longer see your own reflection. You will be looking at the devil. Or at least looking at the way he has chosen to appear to you. Chances are he won't look like the conventional red horned demon with goat legs and a pitchfork, nor any sort of terrible apparition. No, there's no point in scaring you off now. Better to lure you in and make you feel safe. To that end, he generally takes the appearance of a fairly average, nondescript human being. If anything, he's more prone to vanity and will lean towards a more attractive individual. The only really frightening part about him will be his eyes. You see, no matter how hard he tries, he can't hide the sinister gleam smoldering deep within them. The malevolent amusement and hunger, like the eyes of a spider contemplating a fly struggling in its web. They're supremely confident, those eyes. Confident and without pity. Don't look into them too deeply, or you'll begin to feel helpless, paralyzed with dread, losing your hope and will to fight. Since you'll probably just be standing there for a moment in shock, staring at him, having on some level expected for this whole thing to fail, he'll initiate the conversation by asking you what it is you desire from him. If you gather your wits enough to string together a coherent sentence, you should respond with something like this. I wish to challenge you in a game of question and response. Even if you don't get the words exactly right, he'll know what you mean, and he'll accept your request with a wide, predatory grin of anticipation. You see, he's been playing this game for a long time, and he's very good at it. Most humans, on the other hand, they're very bad at it. This gives him a chance to, at the very least, thoroughly mess with your mind, and at most, well, we'll save that for the litany of shit that could go wrong section. You'll have to play it very smart to avoid justifying his expectations. The general rules of the game are very simple, with a few caveats that can make things more complicated. He'll begin by asking you a question. He always initiates the game anyway. It can be anywhere from a piece of obscure trivia to a riddle to an extremely personal inquiry. Don't worry, you won't be immediately plunged into hell for getting the wrong answer, or anything like that. As a matter of fact, he won't even tell you if you got it right or wrong. After you've answered his question, you get to ask him one in return. Now here is where the consequences of your response come in. If you answered his last question correctly, he will respond to your question as honestly and as accurately as he is able. However, if you answered incorrectly, he is free to lie as he sees fit. Perhaps you've asked him something you're better off not knowing. He'll tell you the truth about it anyway. More likely, he'll feed you the most insidious, damaging lie he can come up with. Either way, after he's responded, he'll ask you another question, and the process will repeat over and over and over again until you decide to call it quits. Now you may be sitting there thinking, oh, that sounds fairly easy to get the information that I need. All I need to do is wait for a question that I can answer correctly, and boom, there we go. No. Ignoring everything else that he said, well, it's not that simple. You see, he will never give you an easy question, one that you can be completely sure of. He may instead give you a question that you have some vague knowledge of, or that make you think maybe you know the answer, but you're not really that confident, thus forcing you to endlessly second-guess yourself, obsessing over whether or not you can trust the information that he gave you next. Perhaps you'll think that what he said was a lie, wish it was a lie, but be eternally consumed by doubt, unable to fully convince yourself that you were wrong. Or perhaps you'll have to make a huge choice based on the information that he gave you, and be tormented by the fear and indecisiveness as you realize your fate, and perhaps the fate of others as well, rests entirely upon whether or not you were able to correctly recall some arcane piece of trivia you don't even remember now. You'll never remember the exact questions that he's going to ask you, by the way. That would make it too easy for you to go back and check your responses. Or maybe, instead of testing your knowledge, he'll ask you something personal, something you even lie to yourself about. You'll answer back to him thinking you've gotten the question correct. No, I don't resent my sister. Yes, I would return the money into the police. But he'll know better. He'll know better than you that you're lying. And he'll lie to you in return. And you will believe him. You'll believe him until you're no longer able to deceive yourself, and by then, it might be too late. Or maybe, he won't even give you a chance to get an accurate response at all. Maybe he'll just ask you an endless string of completely impossible questions, making you more and more frustrated and disheartened as you realize you'll never be able to force him the truth. Questions like, what was the exact height of Mount Everest in centimeters in the year of 1666? Or, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Although knowing a sense of humor, if he ever asked you the latter, he might consider African or European a correct response. There are a couple of ways to short-circuit this particular strategy, however. Additional rules and courses of action that can make the game more interesting and prevent you from being stonewalled completely. Although in all honesty, he probably wants you to try one of those options anyway. The first option is to ask him a riddle instead of a question. If you somehow manage to stump him and he answers the riddle wrong or gives up, he'll be obliged to give you a truthful response to your next question. If he answers the riddle correctly, once again, don't worry, he won't pounce on you. What will happen is that he will get a pass, allowing him to lie in response to one question he otherwise would be obliged to answer truthfully. Honestly, if he gets a pass, you might as well just give up and quit right there. It's impossible to determine if he's lying. Adding another layer of complexity by constantly trying to figure out if he's used his pass or not, well, it's about enough to drive any normal person to insanity now, isn't it? There's no way, so just forget about it. The second option is to take a dare for him. If you accept it and vow to follow through, then once again you'll have to answer the question truthfully. If you choose to reject it, he'll get another pass. Now, before you freak out and reject the whole idea completely, you should know that he won't ask you to do anything overly dramatic or unspeakably evil, like blow up a hospital or murder somebody. As a rule of thumb, most dares won't involve direct loss of life or major felonies. However, they certainly won't be easy. Inflicting severe pain on yourself, doing something that terrifies the shit out of you, cutting off a treasured relationship, publicly humiliating yourself or someone you love. All of these things and more, things you might not even be able to imagine, are completely on the table. If you're willing to go that far to put yourself in that kind of position, you'll get your answer. However, if he manages to come up with one thing you know you simply can't or won't do, well then once again, you might as well just quit. One last thing, don't think you can just tell him you're going to do one thing and then not do it. If you accept the dare and don't follow through with it, well, let's just say the consequences, they'll be dire. So just suck it up and keep your promise no matter what it was. Trust me, you're better off that way. Finally, when you've gotten either the information you wanted or given up on it completely, you may end the ritual by simply thanking the devil for accepting your request and bowing politely at the waist and bidding him farewell. The surface of the mirror will begin to swim and flicker for a moment, and then you'll be looking at your own reflection again. Only when you are absolutely certain that you are looking into your own two eyes again, may you turn away from the mirror, flick the lights back on, and begin to dismantle your precautions. Now, it is important, even if you haven't gotten the information that you wanted, you must end the ritual in this manner before 66 minutes have elapsed. Well, I suppose that technically you have 66 minutes and 6 seconds. Subtle, right? But if you're seriously trying to cut it that close without any kind of timekeeping device, you're probably screwed anyway. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is that you keep this time limit. I'll save the reason behind that for the end, but anyway, I've still got a few more important tips on how to play. Be careful what sort of personal information you give out. Try not to talk about yourself, especially your emotions and problems, any more than absolutely necessary. This guy knows human psychology like the back of his hand, and he will get inside your head. It's like talking to Hannibal Lecter. Give him enough to work with, and even if you don't believe a single word he says, he'll find a way to fuck with you like nobody's business. If anything he asks makes you remotely uncomfortable, do not hesitate to lie through your teeth. There will be plenty of other questions. On a similar note, try to keep the game on track and moving briskly. Unstructured interactions of any kind are to be avoided. Chances are that at some point he will try to draw you off on a tangent, discussing something that fascinates you, analyzing a response you've given him, or finding some other excuse to speak at length without moving the game forward. This is not only a waste of valuable time, but also another excellent opportunity to mess with your mind. Third, if you choose to give him a riddle, use one you've made up yourself. If your riddle has ever been written down anywhere at all, from the pages of The Hobbit to some long-lost tome of ancient magic, he will already know the answer. That said, it still has to be legitimate, with answers that make logical sense from an angle. You can't just ask him something like, "What's green, has 10 legs, and hops," and then claim for some inexplicable reason the answer was marshmallows. Nor can you ask him a straight question like, "What have I got in my pocket?" Because he probably already knows that anyway. There are no hard and fast rules to determine whether a riddle makes sense or not, but you're a reasonable human being. Your ancestors ate from the tree of knowledge. So please, for the love of crap, use common sense. 4. If you choose to take a dare, there is a slight chance the devil will ask you to do something seemingly easy. Deliver a letter, scribble a 10-digit number on a restroom stall, something like that. If he does ask you for something like this, if you have a shred of common decency and you do not accept, chances are that he's using you to further some sinister plot, one liable to ruin a lot of lives and hurt a lot of people. Who knows? You're the type of person who really doesn't mind throwing an unknown total number of strangers under the bus to find out what you want to know. But hey, at least be aware of what you are doing is that. Last but not least, be very aware of the time. It might be helpful to do some practicing beforehand and
get a feel for how long an hour is without a watch. The devil will probably put off discussing things you're most keen to find out for as long as he can, and as you near the 66-minute deadline, he'll start trying harder and harder to distract you, to captivate you, and otherwise keep you from playing until it's too late. He'll string you along, feed you little glimmers of false hope, keep you thinking, just a few more minutes, I'm almost there. Yeah, don't fall for it. Don't go over the time limit, no matter what. Now, you might be thinking that this game doesn't sound that dangerous at all so far. Yeah, threats of psychological damage rarely carry the same sort of weight as threats of physical damage, even though their costs are often just as great. Yeah, hate to burst your bubble there, kid, but the game is far from safe. There are plenty of ways for you to seriously screw yourself over both physically and mentally, and spiritually. And it is with this that I will conclude in the vain hope that they may make some sort of impression. First, while you are speaking with the devil, do not let him out of your sight. You keep staring at that mirror no matter what happens. He will undoubtedly try various tricks to make you look away. You will hear noises behind you, feel eyes on the back of your neck, see shadowy phantoms writhing in the depths of the mirror. A cold breath will blow upon you from behind, smelling like the crypt. A deep silence will settle, only be interrupted by a loud smack directly behind your head, giving you about the worst jump scare you've ever had. Hell, the devil may even abandon a measure of his own dignified facade to give a sudden jump of feigned shock, shouting loudly and pointing behind you with a very convincing look of terror on his face. Whatever he might test you with, you must not look away from him. If you look away, if you lose sight of him completely for even a second, you will look back at the mirror to find him gone. Well, not gone, but out of the mirror, and in the room, with you. Exactly how much of the body the police will find the next morning, and what state is in, will depend entirely on the sort of mood he's in. The same thing goes if you break any of the protections you have laid down before beginning the ritual, interrupting the circle of salt, letting the red string untwine, knocking over a candle, or letting one go out. Any of these things will free him from the mirror, and then, well, you're all a bunch of creative horror junkies. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks. On a different topic, you may reach a point in the game, probably after a long series of maddeningly impossible questions, where the devil asks you a deceptively simple question. What is your full name? You must not give it to him. Names can be things of great power. Now, although the devil will, and of course, already know your name, telling it to him is akin to inviting a vampire into your house. Your name is deeply synonymous with your own inner self, thus giving him your name is powerfully symbolic of giving him yourself. If you are foolish enough to make this mistake, all of your protections will be for nothing, and he will seize upon you with malicious glee, stealing away your soul and dragging it back with him into hell. At least this way the police will find a complete body. As a matter of fact, your vacant shell will be totally unblemished, almost like you dropped dead of sheer terror. Last but certainly not least, there's the matter of what happens if you go over the time limit. Now you see, this is arguably the worst thing you can do. Now, you won't think so at first. The devil will give you no indication that you have in fact exceeded the time limit, and you will conclude the ritual as if nothing had gone wrong. Perhaps, as the devil's image in the mirror trembles and gives away, you'll see a particularly nasty, triumphant smirk flash across his face. But this will easily be dismissed. You'll turn the lights back on, gather your belongings, and go to leave the room, but when you open the door, you will see nothing. That's right, nothing. Just a flat, white void extending infinitely in all directions. Only the room which was reflected in the mirror now exists. Incidentally, if you turn back around and face the mirror again, you may even catch a last glimpse of your own reflection. Perhaps it will even turn and favor you with a smirk. in a cheeky wave before sweeping out the door into the perfectly normal church hallway outside. As you may have already figured out, you are no longer yourself in the church. Your soul is now trapped in the mirror, and the devil has taken the liberty of possessing your body now that you're no longer using it, of course. Yeah, pound on the glass and scream all you like, you'll never get out on your own, and no exorcist can help you now, son. But don't worry, it's not like you're in hell, right? At least, not necessarily. What you have to understand, see, is that a human soul stripped of its flesh is a deeply volatile and vulnerable thing, especially when trapped in the land of the living. You see, you are now an entity of purely mental properties, and as such, the barriers between what is real and what is imaginary have been completely dissolved. As you fill that reflected room with your anger, your sorrow, your fear at being trapped, these emotions will begin to coalesce, given form by your mind. You see, if you're not a particularly imaginative person, these creatures may not be too terrible. They may not be able to inflict too much horror or pain. But with time, you maybe even teach yourself to get rid of them. If, however, yours is a mind haunted by monsters, a mind that is vibrantly creative and imaginative and more than usually twisted, well, there's no telling what horrors might come clawing their way out of the maelstrom. Tasting sweet release from the confines of your subconscious, hungering for your terror and suffering. They will refuse to be banished, dragging you kicking and screaming into an endless positive feedback loop of pain. Yet, needless to say, if you're a regular patron of websites like this one, you're probably pretty well fucked. There's only one way to find release from the mirror. They say that if you call upon him once more and ask him to free you, he'll be willing to take you out. For the usual fee, of course. Hey, who knows? Maybe your imagination is twisted and powerful enough to create a personal hell that leaves you begging for the real thing. And hey, those talents might be put to good use. There are over 7 billion people in the world after all. Even the devil himself can't be messing around with their minds all at once. Talented help is always appreciated. Of course, the corollary to your being trapped inside the mirror is that the devil now gets to do whatever he wants in your body until sunrise. Around that time, your body will mercifully drop dead from the strain of possession, and autopsy will identify the cause as a kind of coronary event. Now, don't get too relieved at this point, though. He's perfectly capable of stirring up plenty of trouble in a few hours. For instance, he might decide to do something big and dramatic like purchase a large meat cleaver and go on a murdering spree, starting with the names in your own address book, and working his way out to complete strangers, if he has the time. Or perhaps he'll focus on only one person, someone who trusts you completely, using your persona to get him or her alone, and vulnerable. And then, well, no need to describe it here. Once again, I'm sure you can think of a few things. Yeah, starting to see why I call this the worst outcome yet? Of course, there's also a chance that he won't lay a finger on any of your loved ones, instead deciding to do something a little more subtle, a little more insidious, like drop off a few nondescript, unmarked packages on certain doorsteps in the dangerous part of town, or locate a particularly dusty, aged yellow text in the storeroom of your local library and intentionally misfile it in the young adult literature section. Or whisper 7 very choice words into the ear of a distracted-looking young redhead waiting for the 3 a.m. subway. Or maybe he'll decide that in this day and age of waning superstition and not enough people getting interested in his games, and the knowledge and danger seeming to be lost, maybe he'll decide that what he needs is to get the word out there a bit more, to do a bit more networking, attract some new challengers. Maybe he'll take a quick peek at your browser history, see where the impressionable, curious minds are hanging out these days. Maybe he'll write up a quick tutorial in modern parlance and rather inscrutable, obsolete demological text, post it on the internet somewhere, and see how many bites he can get. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have gone there, but if you made it this far without shying away, a little twist at the end isn't going to put you off, is it, dear reader? I'm sure that there are plenty of intrepid adventurers among you with burning questions you'd like answered. And hey, you're all a smart bunch. You all know the pitfalls and you know the conventions. You live and breathe this sort of thing, don't you? There's no way you'd fall into any of the obvious traps, right? You're not some Dick or Jane off the street. After all, you'd be bringing a whole new level of competition. You would... Oh, excuse me just one moment. Someone's calling for me. What? You went out that badly already? You must have one hell of an imagination. Perfect.
I first met in person with Mary E. in the summer of 2007. I had arranged with her husband of 15 years, Terrence, to see her for an interview. Mary had initially agreed, since I was not a newsman but rather a amateur writer gathering some information on a few early college assignments, and if all went according to plan, some pieces of fiction. We scheduled the interview for a particular weekend when I would be in Chicago on unrelated business, but at the last moment, Mary changed her mind and locked herself in the couple's bedroom, refusing to meet with me. For half an hour I sat with the husband as we camped outside the bedroom, I listening and taking notes while he attempted fruitlessly to calm his wife. The things Mary said to me made little sense, but fit the pattern I was expecting. Though I could not see her, I could tell from her voice that she was crying, and more often than not, her objections to speak to me centered around her incoherent diatribe on her dreams, or her nightmares. Terrence apologized profusely, and when we ceased the exercise, and I did my best to take it in stride. Recall that I wasn't a reporter in search of a story, but merely a curious young man in search of information. Besides, I thought at the time I could perhaps find another similar case if I put my mind and resources to it. Mary E. was the soy sop for a small Chicago-based bulletin board system in 1992 when she first encountered Smile.jpeg, and her life was forever changed. Mary was one of an estimated 400 people who had saw the image when it was first posted as a hyperlink on the BBS. Though she is the only one who has spoken openly about the experience, the rest have remained anonymous. Or are perhaps dead. In 2005, when I was only in 10th grade, Smile.jpeg was first brought to my attention as a burgeoning interest in web-based phenomena. Mary was most often cited as a victim of what's sometimes referred to as Smile.dog. The being Smile.jpeg is reputed to display. What caught my interest, other than the obvious macabre elements of cyber legend and my proclivity towards such things, was the sheer lack of information, usually to the point that people don't believe it even exists other than as a rumor or as a hoax. It is unique because, though the entire phenomenon centers on a picture file, that file is nowhere to be found on the internet. Certainly many manipulated photos litter the web, showing up most frequently on sites such as 4chan and especially on the X-Base phenomenon board. It is suspected that these are fakes because they do not have the effect that the true Smile.jpeg has, namely sudden onset temporal lobe epilepsy and acute anxiety. The purported reaction in the viewer is one of these reasons the phantom-like Smile.jpeg is regarded with such disdain, since it is patently absurd, though depending on whom you may ask, the reluctance to acknowledge Smile.jpeg's existence might be just as much out of fear as it is out of disbelief. Neither Smile.jpeg nor Smile.dog is mentioned anywhere on Wikipedia, though the website features articles on such others, perhaps more scandalous shock sites as Hello.jpg or 2 Girls 1 Cup. Any attempt to create a page pertaining to Smile.jpeg is summarily deleted. Encounters with Smile.jpeg are the stuff of internet legend. Mary E's story is not unique. There are unverified rumors of Smile.jpeg showing up in the early days of Usenet, and even one persistent tale that in 2002 a hacker flooded the forums of the humor and satire site Something Awful with a deluge of Smile.dog pictures, rendering almost half of the forum's users at the time epileptic. It is also said that the mid to late 90s that Smile.jpeg circulated the Usenet as an attachment of chain email with the subject line, "Smile, God loves you." Yet despite the huge exposure these stunts would generate, there are very few people who admit to having experience with any of them, and no trace or file could be found. Those who claim to have Smile.jpeg often weakly joke that they were far too busy to save a copy of the picture to their hard drive. However, all alleged victims offer the same description of the photo. A dog-like creature, usually described as appearing similar to a Siberian husky, illuminated by the flash of a camera, sits in a dim room, the only background detail that is visible being a human hand extending from the darkness near the left side of the frame. The hand is empty but is usually described as beckoning. Of course, most attention is given to the dog, or dog creature, as some victims are more certain than others to claim. The muzzle of the beast is repeatedly split into a wide grin, revealing 2 rows of very white, very straight, very sharp, and very human-looking teeth. This is, of course, not a description given immediately after viewing the picture, but rather a recollection of the victims who claim to have seen the pictures endlessly repeated in their mind's eye during the time that they, in reality, having epileptic fits. These fits are reported to continue intermittently, often while the victims sleep, resulting in very vivid and disturbing nightmares. These may be treated with medicine, though in some sense it is often more effective than others. Mary E, I assumed, was not on effective medication. That was why after my visit to her apartment in 2007, I sent out feelers to several folklore and urban legend oriented news groups, websites, and mailing lists, hoping to find the name of a supposed victim of Smile.jpeg, who felt more interested in talking about his experience. For a time, nothing happened, and at length I forgot completely about my pursuits since I had begun my freshman year of college and was quite busy. Mary contacted me via email, however, near the beginning of March 2008.
From Mary E. Subject: Last summer's interview. Dear Mr. L., I am incredibly sorry about my behavior last summer when you came to interview me. I hope you understand that it was no fault of yours, but rather my own problems that led me to act out as I did. I realized that I could have handled the situation more decorously. However, I hope you will forgive me. At the time, I was afraid. You see, for 15 years I have been haunted by Smile.jpg. Smile.dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it's true. There's an ineffable quality about my dreams, my nightmares, that make them completely unlike any real dreams I have ever had. I do not move and do not speak. I simply look ahead, and the only thing ahead of me is the scene from that horrible picture. I see the beckoning hand. I see the smile dog. It talks to me. It is not a dog, of course, though I am not quite sure what it really is. It tells me that it will leave me alone, if only I do as it asks. All I must do, it says, is spread the word. That is how it phrases its demands, and I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else. And I could. The week after my incident, I received in the mail a manila envelope with no return address. Inside was only a 3.5-inch floppy diskette. Without having to check, I knew precisely what was on it. I thought for a long time about my options. I could show it to a stranger, a coworker, could even show it to Terrence, as much as the idea disgusts me. And what would happen then? Well, if Smile Dog kept its word, I could sleep. Yet if it lied, what would I do? And who was to say something worse would not come for me if I did as the creature asked? So I did nothing for 15 years. Though I kept the diskette hidden amongst my things. Every night for 15 long years, Smile Dog has come to me in my sleep and demanded that I spread the word. For 15 years, I have stood strong, though there have been hard times. Many of my fellow victims on the BBS board, where I first encountered Smile.jpeg, stopped posting. I heard some of them committed suicide. Others remain completely silent, simply disappearing off the face of the web. They're the ones I worry about the most. I sincerely hope you forgive me, Mr. L. But last summer, when you contacted me and my husband about an interview, I was near the breaking point. I decided I was going to give you the floppy diskette. I did not care if Smile Dog was lying or not. I wanted it to end. You were a stranger, someone I had no connection with, and I thought I would not feel sorrow when you took the diskette as part of your research and sealed your own fate. Before you arrived, I realized what I was doing. I was plotting to ruin your life. I couldn't stand the thought, and in fact I still can't. I'm ashamed. Mr. L, I hope that this warning will dissuade you from further investigation of Smile.jpg. You may in time encounter someone who is, if not weaker than I, then wholly more depraved. Someone who will not hesitate to follow Smile Dog's orders. Stop while you're still whole. Sincerely, Mary E.
Terrence contacted me later that month with the news that his wife had killed herself. While cleaning up the various things she'd left behind, closing email accounts and the like, he happened upon the above message. He was a man in shambles. He wept as he told me to listen to his wife's advice. He'd found the diskette, he revealed, and burned it until it was nothing but a stinking pile of blackened plastic. The part that disturbed him the most, however, was how the diskette had hissed as it melted. Like some sort of animal, he said. I will admit that I was a little uncertain about how to respond to this. At first, I thought perhaps it was a joke, with the couple belatedly playing with the situation in order to get a rise out of me. A quick check of several Chicago newspapers' online obituaries, however, proved that Mary E. was indeed dead. There was, of course, no mention of suicide in the article. I decided that, for a time at least, I would not further pursue the subject of Smile.jpeg, especially since I had finals coming up at the end of May. But the world has an odd way of testing us. Almost a full year later, I returned from my disastrous interview with Mary E. I received another email.
Hello. I found your email address through a mailing list. Your profile said you are interested in Smile Dog. I have saw it. It is not as bad as everyone says. I have sent it to you here. Just spreading the word.
The final line chilled me to the bone. According to my email client, there was one file attached called, naturally, Smile.jpg. I considered downloading it for some time. It was most likely a fake, I imagined, and even if it weren't, I was never wholly convinced of Smile.jpeg's peculiar powers. Mary E.'s account had shaken me, yes, but she was probably mentally imbalanced anyway. After all, how could a simple image do what Smile.jpeg was set to accomplish? What sort of creature was it that could break one's mind with only the power of an eye? And if such things were patently absurd, then why did the legend exist at all? If I downloaded the image, if I looked at it, and if Mary turned out to be correct, if Smile.jpeg came to me in my dreams demanding that I spread the word, what would I do? Would I live my life as Mary had, fighting against the urge to give in until I died? Or would I simply spread the word, eager to be put to rest? And if I chose the latter route, how could I do it? Whom would I burden in turn? If I went through my earlier intention to write a short article about Smile.jpeg, I decided I could attach it as evidence. And anyone who read the article, anyone who took interest would be affected. And even assuming that Smile.jpeg attached to the email was genuine, would I be capricious enough to save myself in that manner? Could I spread the word? Yes. Yes, I could.
Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas did not kill them, since it was fatal in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they only had microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows to view into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and a toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, being promised, falsely, that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly dramatic events in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on darker aspects after the 4th day mark. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that led them to where they were, and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternatively whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades, the other subjects in captivity with them. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about his behavior is how the others in captivity reacted to it, or rather, did not react to it. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The 2 non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared the pages with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working. Since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside, the oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives. They were afraid they were either dead or vegetables. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor, or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voice response. "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any response using intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed with the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. The chamber was open, and soldiers were sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state of any of them life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chests stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was blood was never determined. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone of their fingertips indicated that wounds were self-inflicted by hand and by teeth. The abdominal organs and the ribcage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while the heart, lungs, diaphragm remained in place. The skin and most of the muscle attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs to the ribcage, and the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out in the eviscerated but still living bodies of the test subject. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It became quickly apparent that they were digesting what was their own flesh and what they had eaten off themselves over the course of the days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber, and alternatively begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the test subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arm of one of the doctor. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he bled out to the point where there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room the facility had. In their process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given to him to prepare for the surgery. He fought fiercely against his restraints, and when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under, he managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on his wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier holding that wrist as well. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the normal level of oxygen. His muscles were still attached to his skeleton, were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles that had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first of the group of the 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords were destroyed and he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when an anesthetic gas was brought near him. He shook his head yes when someone suggested, reluctantly, that they try surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of placing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon proceeding stated repeatedly that it should be medically impossible for a patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Assuming this must be something of a drastic importance to the surgeon, had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had injected a paralytic for the duration of the operation. The surgeons found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers in their eyes. The paralytic cleared their system of an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped their own guts out, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. The only response was given:
I must remain awake.
All three subjects' restraints were enforced and reinforced, and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done next. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the subjects. The commanding officer, an ex-KGB, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all three stopped struggling the moment it slipped that they were going to be put back on the gas. It was obvious at this point the three were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all of his might, first left, then right, then left again, for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired to the EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably, and looked as though he were repeatedly suffering brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on the papers scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut, and at the same moment his head hit the pillow, his brainwaves immediately changed to that of deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves show the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as three researchers. One of the named three immediately drew his gun and shot Commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed the gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical team and research fled the room. I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you. He screamed at the man strapped to the table. What are you? He demanded. I must know. The subject smiled.
Have you forgotten so easily?
The subject asked.
We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread.
The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's head and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. So nearly free.
During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange, human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact. Most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in the rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from an extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remained powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers later that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. A suicide note, dated 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to massage any guilt or pain I have introduced to this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once, I awoke and felt his presence. And once I awoke and saw his form. And once again, I heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Lenny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. A journal entry, translated from Spanish, dated 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand, I will not sleep. His voice. The rest is unintelligible text. A mariner's log, dated 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake. From an eyewitness account in 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip to Niagara Falls for the 4th of July with my family. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. However, about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man with, or maybe a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, and it was as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At some point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled out of the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot away from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds. Or, well, probably closer to 5. It just seemed like a while. But it was just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see. It crouched and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter, Clara. The creature ran downstairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night while rushing my daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly, and the police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature that we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believe to be accounts of the Rake. None of them give any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving a creature in its first 3 pages and never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person, multiple people also mentioning being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blurring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed. This still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and now I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I will wake up to see him staring at me. I went camping about 3 weekends ago in the Hunstville National Forest near Texas. Me and 3 friends that came home for that weekend, they were all in college, and usually we all get together at least once a year. Old friends from high school and all that. For the camping trip, we planned to go backpacking deep into the forest, live off what fish and other wildlife we could catch. We've been doing this for a while in Texas and numerous places: Arizona, Colorado, if anyone is familiar with the Spanish Peaks there, New Mexico. So we're pretty much used to anything you could encounter out there. It was my turn to pick up where we went camping, so I chose Huntsville. More accurately, it's Huntsville/New Waverly, so... Anyway, so we drive up to the park in our car and get to the nice spot and start walking off into the forest. We had some laughs along the way, everyone catching up with each other's lives. We walked until it started to get dark and set up camp where we stopped. Everyone gathered wood to make fire and we set our tent up. And we do what we always do. Try to scare each other with weird stories. Around this time, we started to smell something very faint. It was noticeable, but not overbearing. We couldn't put our finger on it. We just couldn't find out what it was. So we just carried on. Mike had to go piss, and he walked off into the forest. A second later, he came running back, piss all down his jeans like he missed really bad. Immediately, we all crack up and throw some jokes at him, but then we noticed that he was white as snow and trying to catch his breath. He starts screaming for us to follow him and runs off. We all get serious and go follow him. Not knowing what the problem was, we started to hear a faint scream and crying in the distance, in the direction where we were running. It was pitch black away from the camp, and Mike had the only flashlight. We left ours back at camp, of course. But anyway, he had to go take a piss, so he only had one. So at this stage, we didn't have much of a choice but to follow the light. It was frantically pointing here and there in front of him. The scream gets closer to Mike, and he started slowing down. We then noticed a ratty old cabin that looked like it was abandoned except for a faint light that we could see coming from one of the old mildew-covered windows. The crying was intense. Whoever it was couldn't breathe enough to let out a full yell. We followed Mike up the front door, and we could all hear the crying from inside. As soon as he knocked on the front door, it stopped. We all waited and heard really heavy footsteps walking fast to the door. There was a giant slam against the door and the sound of the bolt locking. Then nothing. We waited for a bit, knocked a few times, but still nothing happened. We walked around the house. There was no fucking way any of us were leaving each other's side. And we noticed a window, which was a good ways up, but anyway, Alex took a deep breath and asked us to give him a boost. So, we did. Me and Mike lifted him up to the window. We watched as he brushed away dirt and webs from the window and placed his face close to the window, trying to see anything, something at least. There was a quick beat, then suddenly he breathed in fast and let out a loud scream, then fell back from the window, screaming bloody murder the whole way. We all tried to calm him down, but he was hysterical. We went to him, but he just started to shake, punch, kick, cuss, you name it, and then he just took off towards camp. None of us wanted to be separated, so we all ran close behind him. We caught up to him and grabbed him and set him down. The fire was dying, so I grabbed some nearby wood that we collected and added it to the fire. My hands were shaking, and I had to do something. I went back to Alex, and we all tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't. He just kept screaming, and he was breathing so hard that eventually he fainted. All of us are terrified now, and we all kept the fire high until sunrise. Periodically, Alex kept waking up, screaming just like before, but by sunrise he looked catatonic, just mumbling to himself and whimpering. Me and Mike decided to go look at the cabin now. It was daylight, but anyway, we searched where we thought it was, except there was nothing there. Nothing at all, and the indistinct smell from last night had grown into a very strong smell of something dead and stale. We headed back to the camping site. When we got there, we found Alex had chewed into the sides of his face and was swallowing so much blood that he was throwing up. John was at his back, and he looked like he was about to die from exhaustion. I guess we all looked that way. I didn't notice it until I saw his face. Alex said quietly that we need to leave, now. We all started to pack up the tent, and it started to rain really heavily. It was about noon at this point, and the sky started to grow really dark. Alex started to go into a panic. He went and grabbed a large stick and yelled at us to leave it, and then he'd knock us out or drag us there himself. Mike started to yell at him, and then they started to fight. We broke it up, and we finished packing, and then we started to make our way back. After a little while, we arrived at a creek that we had crossed the previous day, only it flooded over. The water was moving too fast for us to cross. Alex started to scream again, yelling at Mike for taking his time packing up the tent when we could have gotten out of there. This went on for a while until we finally convinced Alex to calm down and tell us what happened. He said as soon as he put his face against the glass, a face was on the other side and did the same thing, and it started to smile really big. It had dark eyes and a dark mouth which was bigger than Alex's. As the smile got as large as it could, a giant shadow behind it swung something down and sliced its face off. The face was stuck to the window, and he said it started to laugh quietly as it slid down. Mike, still pissed off, and though he wouldn't admit it, beginning to get freaked out, started to argue with him again. We eventually started to follow the creek for a way to cross. When then we started to see toys floating in the creek. Really old toys. Old Barbie dolls and baby dolls. This wasn't like any old trash floating in the creek, though. This was a lot of Barbies. A lot of baby dolls. One washed towards the side, and Mike picked it up. It had some kind of voice chip that was dying and started to say some gurgling words that we couldn't understand, followed by a sad excuse for laughter. Then it sounded like it was whispering. We thought the batteries must be dying, and then he threw it down. We kept going, and the sun was starting to set. Alex was freaking out more now, and was whimpering and breathing heavily. We all started to see shadows moving behind trees, something we called BS on until we were all seeing it. It was barely light out, and we had to stop. So we see the cabin was right in front of us. None of us knows what to do, what to think. Mike says, this is bullshit. I'm going there. Alex tries to stop him. We all do, but he just wanted to go home. We all just wanted to go home. Mike says to all of us to fuck off, do our own thing. He doesn't care anymore. This is all bullshit. We started to hear hundreds of the same sort of baby dolls as before, laughing, whispering, and trying to sing. We started to move forward past the cabin, all of us, and kept pushing forward. We smelled something dead in the air, something stale. The same something as before. We started to hear something dying, something crying, something screaming. We kept going. We eventually crossed the creek and left the woods. We get back to our vehicle and got in. By now it's pitch black and we drive. We are about to get on the 45 to Houston, but the road is under construction and it can't be accessed. It points to a detour. As we head towards the detour, it seems to be small, bumpy roads going into the woods. We then see a young girl come up to us. She looked like she was in trouble, young, pretty. She approaches the passenger side and looks like she's really drugged up or beaten up. Alex doesn't roll down the windows, nor does he open the door. She reaches for the handle and he immediately locks it. She puts her face on the window and starts to smile really, really big. And so we floor it. Alex starts to cry and scream and we all begin to breathe heavy. We finally cut and take a street that takes us up to the 45 and we take it the whole way. When we get back to my apartment, everyone doesn't know what to say and we all break apart and go our separate ways. Mike messages me later and he says he's going to go back. I try to convince him not to, and all he does is say it was our own mind screwing with us. I think he just wants to prove to himself he wasn't scared, but I can smell that stench everywhere now. I don't go out anymore. I just stay in, and I don't answer the door. Last week, everyone I met was acting really strange. People that I knew for a long time, and total strangers. My own dad, when I went to his place to eat supper with him, he just watched me strangely when I was sitting down. He didn't say a word the whole time. I kept asking him, what's wrong? And he just slowly shook his head. When I was leaving to go home, I turned to wave. He had black eyes and an open mouth like he was in pain. When I started to walk back, he shut the door and bolted it. I stayed there knocking and knocking. Nothing. I called him. His phone was disconnected. I even called the police. Halfway through the questions they were asking me, the connection started to get faded and staticky. I could hear a faint mumbling, and then singing and laughing. Mike has completely vanished at this point. There is not even a record of him being alive. When I call Alex's house, they talk to me like I'm some sort of salesperson. They say they don't know any Alex and to please stop calling. The person who tells me that is Alex's mother. I can't get a hold of John. Someone knocked on my door. When I went to look, I saw a face completely covering the peephole, and a giant smile started to form. Sir, are you affected by any drugs at the moment? No. Are you coming home anytime soon? Excuse me? Come home. And then the phone call ended. My mail slot swings open every now and then. Someone's sliding in pieces of baby dolls through it. I try to call people now and all I can hear is static and bad baby doll noises and this crying and screaming. My TV is busted, but when I go to piss I can hear it on. I might be going insane. Whoever lives above me started to scream in pain and crying deeply recently. I hear giant footsteps from their apartment. I hear bangs and something falling to the ground. From the neighbors to the right of my apartment, I hear what sounds like a baby that never gets tended to. And then it sounds like a baby whose batteries... And then it sounds like a baby doll whose batteries are dying. My phone has been ringing now, and it's Alex telling me things in a language that I've never heard before, nor could even manage to repeat. I keep getting emails of pictures of black and small colorations. Now I can't even access my email. Someone knocks on the door, then they slam against it. I hear the bolts unlocking one by one, and I run to make sure they're all locked. And then I just sit down. And I begin to cry.